Hi, welcome, class. So today we are going to be going over Enlightened Despots and the French Revolution. This lecture is going to focus on a few of the, quote unquote, enlightened despots of Europe, the ones that were trying to incorporate some of the Enlightenment ideals into their monarchies. However, we are going to see that it was not always implemented with the utmost of care, and then how all of that led into the French Revolution, and then how the French Revolution, in effect, is also going to reverberate back onto itself in relation to the other monarchies. And so this is all a kind of circular political, game and machine that's focusing in Europe right now. And then after this, we are going to look at the rise and fall of Napoleon and go forward into Russia a bit more. And so that is going to be for the next lecture. But as far as right now, let's go over some of the large monarchs and the French Revolution, which I believe is, within world history at least, one of the more famous solidified moments of history. And some topics that we're going to be covering today, pretty much broken up into two sections. First section is going to be the Enlightened Despots themselves, encompassing Tsarina, Elizabeth I, and Catherine the Great. We're going to be looking at Frederick the Great, and then a snapshot of the Holy Roman Empire. And then we will be going into the French Revolution and have a discussion of how it came to be, some of the specific details surrounding the French Revolution itself, and ultimately what the outcome was going to be. So, part one, Enlightened Despots. Before we get into that, let us do a quick snapshot, because last time we had been working on our various slides from the last chapter, and we looked at a few familiar names, John Locke, Hobbes, and others, right? These kind of like philosophers and Enlightenment thinkers. And so I want to throw in Voltaire into the mix, because that is the last piece of the puzzle. And so Voltaire, as all of these guys were, he was a thinker, he was a historian, a philosopher, what have you. And his main belief was we should have freedom of speech and the ability to criticize religion or the government and all of our leaders, but also believed that folks should be tolerant of each other's beliefs, even if you disagree with them. And so even though he held some of these good views, right, objectively, inherently Voltaire distrusted democracy, because he did not like the quote-unquote idiocy of the masses. There is something to be said for once you get a large enough crowd, they stop acting like intelligent, rational human beings, and they start to act like a mob. And so he did not necessarily agree with that or like it. And so he thought it was best as a form of government to have an enlightened monarch that could bring around meaningful change. So essentially all of the powerful monarchs that we have seen thus far, that was his ideal. But in addition to that, give them a little bit extra, right, of those Enlightenment ideals for them to hopefully kind of elevate themselves, their nation, improve education and start implementing reforms and all of these kind of things. And so ultimately, his work started to get more and more popular as all of these Enlightenment thinkers had their policies become popular and their viewpoints. And monarchs throughout Europe, especially the ones that wanted to read all of these materials and educate themselves, they truly started to take some of it at heart. And they're not stupid, right? They were seeing the way that society and the intellectual circles were changing. And so they could kind of see the writing on the wall. And, some of these rulers began to implement various reforms and changes. But as we're going to be seeing, with varying levels of change, with varying levels of intent, right, within that. And so Mr. Voltaire here himself, you know, definitely one of the kind of higher echelon of French thinkers and philosophers that we have viewed so far. Definitely going and encapsulating, engraving himself amongst the company of, Rousseau and, Hobbes and others. And so let's start getting into some of the despots. Are they truly enlightened? Question mark. That's going to be kind of a main key. So what is an quote-unquote enlightened despot? They are authoritarian leaders who are trying to enact the principles of the Enlightenment. And once again, from our Enlightenment section, the Enlightenment ideals were, putting forth more humanistic ideals, right? That the person has some type of rights, God-given inalienable rights that nobody, not even a monarch, should stamp out. Other wonderful ideas such as representative government and, some type of, early forms of perhaps writings of Bill of Rights, sharing power, maybe separation of government. So all of these wonderful ideals started to proliferate. And so an enlightened monarch would be a traditional monarch who starts to read all of this material and try to incorporate some of it into their society in the form of, reforms, changing the tax systems or politics or something meaningful, right? And so these were individuals that were students of the Enlightenment and also were monarchs themselves. And, as time is going on more and more, and these Enlightenment thinkers are, of course, publishing their works, and they are being spread all throughout Europe. Folks are starting to see their monarchs and their leaders less like a, God-given holy figure, and more of a, human, mortal authority figure who happens to be in a position of power and authority, right? And so that is a completely different dynamic. If you believe that the person in charge has God-given rights to rule, that's a completely different relationship versus you understand that they are a mortal human being and that they happen to be in this position of authority and power, and their job is to make your life better, right? So that understanding starts to shift. And so the main point here is, as we're going to see towards the end of the lecture as well, as these various rulers are trying to implement, right, a lot of these changes, whether it's economic, political, religious, legal, what have you. A lot of these rulers inevitably ended up actually strengthening their own position and making themselves an absolute monarch. And so, that's the true question of our lecture today. Are these folks truly enlightened? Because how can you truly say that you are an enlightened human being and you follow the principles of the Enlightenment when, yes, you make X, Y, and Z reforms, right, for the better of the society, but on the other hand, you are completely strengthening your own position as an absolute monarch, right? That kind of goes against the ideals a bit. And so, it's some gray area in between. But let's start with Russians, right? The Russian authority. So swinging all the way to the east. So let us begin with Elizabeth I. Last time we did a snapshot of Peter the Great, the really tall, charismatic Russian Tsar who was, literally and figuratively dragging Russia into the modern age, right? Away from their feudalistic, traditions and styles and closer toward a more European ideal. And so his daughter, Elizabeth I, later on ends up ascending into the throne. But the way that she does so is very interesting. She does so through a bloodless coup. So essentially, she takes over power for herself and ends up gaining support of the various royal guards and storming the Winter Palace. And so they ended up arresting the emperor and installing herself as Tsarina. And so the history of Russian the Russian czars and the tsarinas is highly interesting because very few moments in history would you see the the female side of the royalty being so engaged, right, to the extent of overthrowing her husband, right, and installing herself as the true empress of the entire people, right? Russia has definitely an interesting history there. But her reign was, very successful. She was very well known for her military engagements, right, expanding Russian power and influence by the sword. At the same time, she was cultivating the arts. She was giving money to art institutions, right, education for young students, for girls, and cultivating as much as she could, right, and kind of bringing in all this knowledge from Europe as well and other areas of the world. But the main name of the game here was the 7 Years' War. We're going to be looking here at the Russians. We're going to look at Prussia and France. And a lot of them were intertwined in this 7 Years' War. And essentially, it was such an enormous conflict, right, that ended up stretching outside of Europe as well. Many historians actually call it the First World War. And the reason for doing so is because at this point in time, Britain, Prussia, France, right, others, they have colonies abroad. And so it's not just being fought, all of these wars and skirmishes on the European front. It's being fought abroad as well. So some historians correctly want to say that this was the First World War, right? And thanks to Mr. Alexei Rumyan, he was a chancellor and a very influential diplomat under the umbrella of Elizabeth I. And he was so charismatic of a diplomat that he was responsible for Russian foreign policy and helped Elizabeth I kind of navigate these crazy waters during this time. So if you could imagine being a ruler, let's say during World War I or World War II, right? Something similar to the 7 Years' War as far as global scale and terms. Foreign policy would just be absolute chaos. And so thanks to him, she was able to, kind of have a much more solid vision of what the Russian Empire was going to do in terms of, let's say, Sweden, Finland, Poland, Turkey, Prussia, and navigating all of that in between. And so the main goal here from Peter the Great and, of course, his daughter Elizabeth I was to establish the Russian Empire as not just a regional power, but also start to be seen as a more globalized power, because Russia stretches from Europe all the way through Central Asia into bordering China, right, and eventually having parts of modern day, what is today Alaska. And so the fact that they are trying to really kind of stretch out a lot of their policies, is a very tricky situation at best. And so here we have the dynamic duo, Elizabeth and Alexei. I love these old European paintings. It's amazing. But everyone kind of looks the same. Pale face, rosy cheeks, but, you gotta love the art style. Here's the Winter Palace that was stormed. Absolutely beautiful. Much of the Russian architecture was modeled after France, right? And after the Palace of Versailles that we saw in the last couple lectures, right? But it's Russia. They wanted to do it bigger and better and covered in gold. So, definitely on the bucket list for places to go. And of course, inside the Winter Palace, the only word that probably will do justice for this is opulence. It is extravagant and opulence to an extraordinary extent. The sheer amounts of marble and gold and, the artistry that goes into it, it's astounding, right? So truly a place to visit in our lifetimes, hopefully. Now, let's get into Catherine the Great, perhaps even more famous than Elizabeth I. Probably the most famous, or one of the most famous Russian rulers, right, in Russian history. Catherine the Great, or Katerina. And so she had a very interesting history. And so let's go through some of it. I wanted to do a little bit more of a deep dive from certain rulers' perspectives, just because they had such an interesting history, and hopefully it, kind of makes the lecture go by faster. But initially, Catherine was not of Russian blood or lineage. She was a German princess. So how in the heck did she ascend into the role of Tsarina, right? Peter the Third, he was Emperor of Russia, and he was Emperor of Russia for a few months. And he was remembered for his immense love and fascination of Prussia. Peter the Third was the next ruler in line after Elizabeth I, right, her son. And so if you could imagine Elizabeth I with her, famous diplomat Alexei, right? They were literally just fighting on the, borders of Europe, trying to expand Russian policy. They had a very anti-Prussia policy, right? Because they were at war with each other. And then as soon as she steps down and passes away, and then Peter III ends up assuming the throne, he always had, for whatever reason, such a fascination with Prussia and Frederick the Great. He wanted to emulate himself as Frederick the Great. And so as soon as he came into power, he began to really kind of emulate, Prussian culture and rule. His first order of business was immediately signing a peace treaty with Prussia, which of course they loved. He began wearing Prussian clothing and styles himself to model himself after Frederick the Great, the leader of Prussia. Fancied himself a military ruler, and he forced his entire palace staff, the male ones, to always kind of go through military-style drills. So he fancied himself a military ruler, quote unquote. But he was such a kind of weird guy that he ends up alienating a lot of his own court, other nobles, and his own wife. And speaking of his wife, who was his wife? None other than Catherine II, or eventually she will be Catherine the Great. Now, she was of German birth. She was a German princess. And when she was younger, Elizabeth I, fell in love with her, right? She noticed that, there was greatness in her from a young age. And so she arranged and set up the marriage. And this was not uncommon because Russian rulers would typically get German princes, right? German princesses, and marry them into the family. And so, she ends up later on being a very, very powerful, intelligent, and highly competent ruler, right? That the Russian people would appreciate throughout the reign that she would have. But how did she end up as Tsarina? After only 6 months of Peter III having his heyday as being the military ruler, quote unquote, and marching his servants at the palace to pretend as though he's some, big shot, he goes away on holiday. But as he is away on holiday, Catherine receives news that one of her co-conspirators, because she's kind of been planning this coup for a while, one of her co-conspirators had been arrested by him. And so immediately she's just like, the gig is up, right? Because he's going to find out and then probably behead me or something. And so she strikes first. She goes to the local barracks with the royal guard, gives an impassioned rallying speech, and quickly goes to the clergy and says, "You will ordain me as the only emperor of Russia, right? I will be the undisputed ruler." She gets those things done. Ends up controlling the armies and the forces because of that, because now all of the legislation and all the rule is coming from the top. And so immediately her husband is arrested. She forces him to abdicate the throne, and then 8 days later, he is mysteriously dead from some altercation and a stabbing. So literally within a few days, Catherine II goes from the wife of a crazed emperor to the empress herself. Definitely a crazy story, but one that is worthy to be mentioned. And here is Peter III trying to emulate himself as the next Frederick the Great, right? And very Prussian-esque type of styles. And here is Catherine the Great toward the beginning/middle of her reign. Now, if you have some time, the video here on the left, Catherine the Great biography, it's a short couple-minute video just kind of recapping her life, how she comes to power, what her rule ends up looking like. If you really want to go into more deeper dive of her history, on the right-hand side, we have a National Geographic documentary. It's around 45 minutes long. If you feel the need to go through and you want to kind of go into more deep dive of it, here is an opportunity to kind of stop the lecture video and get a little bit more information. But let's look at Catherine's Enlightenment a little bit, right? Her quote-unquote Enlightenment. Her reign is considered to be the golden age of the Russian Empire, right? And I was not kidding when I stated that she was a highly intelligent and very competent ruler, right? She was not only ruling with an iron fist, but she was doing a pretty darn good job of it. And so the main point here is that although she was implementing some Enlightenment ideals into the country, she ended up strengthening her monarchy and her absolute monarchy even more. And so, like I said, it's a very gray area. On the one hand, you are implementing some Enlightenment ideals to make life better for the people. On the other hand, you are strengthening your position as an absolute monarch, which directly contradicts with other Enlightenment ideals, right? And so, she was famously writing with many of these philosophers from France. The French during this day and age it was like a center and hotbed for philosophy, for the intelligentsia, for coffee shop discussions. And so she was writing letters back and forth with some of the philosophers, right? Trying to absorb some of this knowledge, trying to kind of understand what her next step is going to be as ruler. In her famous letter with Mr. Diderot, right, one of the famous philosophers, she said, "You philosophers are lucky men. You write on paper, and paper is patient. Unfortunate empress that I am, I write on the susceptible skins of living beings." Essentially, she is critiquing their positions in life. A philosopher has the luxury to sit at a coffee shop and merely write their thoughts. And that's pretty much all there is to it. If you're in a position of ultimate absolute authority as a monarch, your paper are human lives, right? Everything you say and do, it decides life and death for people, right? It's a completely different scenario. But she was, putting forth some of the Enlightenment ideals. She tried to. She ended up advocating for a lot of the ideals, funding mathematicians, scientists, writers, making important contributions to education, the arts, funding all girls' schools, because at that time, girls were not seen as necessary to educate. So she was, in certain areas, truly advancing the science and the literature and, research, right? She really was. On the other hand, Russia does have a very brutalistic history in terms of serfdom and rebellions, because we have the majority of the Russian population living under serfdom, or essentially as peasants, right? Farmhands, if you will. And so, as we can see here, from Pugachev's rebellion, right? This is a great example. From 1773 to 1775, we had over 50 popular rebellions that took place in the empire. Could you imagine that? Over 50 rebellions. And all of these 50 small rebellions ended up eventually culminating into what was known as Pugachev's rebellion, the largest one in Russian history. And Pugachev ended up rallying the Cossacks, the famous Ukrainian, Central Asia kind of steppe warriors, right, that they would implement throughout history and into their armies, famous for their prowess on horseback, right, and with the sword. And so Pugachev rallied the Cossacks and promised the serfs their own land and their own freedom from all of these overlords, freedom from these Russian nobles who were controlling their lives and taxing the living hell out of them. And of course, if you are in the role of Tsar or Tsarina, the buck stops with you. And so immediately it is expected of the ruler to send troops, and Catherine the Great did. And so the troops that were sent brutally crushed the rebellion, ending up in at least 10,000 dead. Pugachev was arrested, put into chains, and sent to Moscow, where he was publicly dismembered. His limbs were ripped apart while he was still alive and made into a public spectacle so that nobody else would want to revolt. And so, like I say many times already, yes, Catherine the Great in some areas was quote-unquote enlightened and an enlightened despot, but a despot nonetheless. And if you are having 50-plus rebellions in the empire, that as a ruler, as an absolute ruler here, right, your main reaction is going to be to kind of further solidify your power, right? Because if there are all of these rebellions, there has to be a strong central government to kind of put them down. And so I suppose in Catherine's perspective, she advocated for Enlightenment policies in areas where she thought would do, a great amount of good, but ones that would not, let's say, stem her power. And in these types of situations, such as large-scale rebellions, that solidified her understanding that these rulers need to retain their power, and for good reason. Otherwise, the mob mentality might come into play. And so this is one of the famous schools that Catherine the Great ends up creating an all-girls institution, right? So that women of the Russian Empire can go and finally get formally trained and educated. And so she was seen as a huge patron of the arts, patron of the education system, and so she was trying to advance the Russian Empire in whatever ways she could towards this kind of more modern view. Now let's look at Frederick II, or he would become to known as Frederick the Great. So we've gone from Russia. We are moving towards Prussia with a P, right? These are geniuses, folks. They come up with these names. And so Russia with a P, Prussia. Located in between Germany and Russia, sort of like Eastern Europe sections, right? And so Frederick II, he ends up being remembered as a very brilliant military mind, growing and expanding the military of his empire to enormous extents, conquering more territory, and becoming also solidified as this enlightened absolute monarch. He was highly intelligent. He was a devout kind of learner of the French language, art, culture, philosophy, right? He was very well read. More times than not, the historical language suggests that you could find Frederick II sitting at a library reading his books versus, right, doing anything else. Much better than Peter III marching and pretending to be a soldier, right, at the palace. And so Frederick II's early life was a bit sad and brutal. And once again, it's very interesting, so I thought I could kind of do a slight deep dive into it to make it a bit interesting for y'all. At the age of 16, Frederick II ended up not publicly, but it was found out that he was having sexual relations with the king's, his father's, 13-year-old page, Keith. And so his father's male, assistant, essentially, right? So the son is having sexual relations with him. And of course, the king does not want all of Prussia and Europe to find out that his son, especially during this day and age, is having homosexual affairs with, whoever, because you have to maintain a strong male lineage, right? So he sent Frederick to the local family hunting lodge, quote unquote, to repent of his sin. And so it should have stopped there. But sadly, it did not. And so at the age of 18, 2 years later, he ends up, having a passionate love affair, with someone else, and the name of Kate, also a male. And they want to flee to England together. Unfortunately, they end up getting intercepted, and his military rank is stripped. He himself, Frederick II, the prince, right, the heir of the throne, is almost executed. And his father was so furious that not only did he do this to him once, but this was the second offense, right? And potentially, in his mind probably, the second major offense and slight to the Prussian Empire. He had his male lover decapitated in front of him to prove a point. And so the main point here that the king wanted to show him was that your duty comes first, right? Your duty to the nation comes first. A brutal lesson to be had, right? So you can feel for the guy. Frederick II is trying to live his best life, and of course his dad ends up, kind of coming in between him and his passions. But his later, bride, of course, a political marriage, as many of these European monarchs have, is, for his future bride, and it is pretty much a loveless marriage. He visits her once a year, and many historians now believe that Frederick's sexuality was a complete central facet of his life, right? And so as they are going back through the literature and going back through the historical content, they can now perhaps, better understand his life and some of the choices he has been making. And so Frederick II on the left-hand side, in more of his youth and vigor, dressed in armor, dressed in this kind of regalia. And then towards the later years of his life, right, on the right-hand side, after numerous military campaigns, right, you can see the slightly more weathered look on the man's face, right? He has, had an enormous amount of stress, right, put onto him. But how did Prussia deal with, all of these changes, especially under Frederick the Great? They were very strongly modernized. So Frederick the Great, just like these other monarchs, ended up transforming Prussia from a backwater location into a powerful economic and political state. And because of the 7 Years' War, that great global war we were talking about, Prussia ended up, being on the better end of it. They ended up gaining territory. They ended up increasing their military. Under Frederick the Great's reign, they more than doubled their military capacity. He made notable changes in their economy, their administration, their judicial system, education, finance, agriculture. The list goes on. The man was reform happy, right? And the people were loving him for it. He was growing the educational system. He went into much of this kind of swampy, wet land and started to actively convert it to farmland, right, for the people, to give them more usable land, approximately 150,000 acres of it. And the people were loving him and singing his praises. In 1739, he gets into a bit of philosophical writing himself because, like I said, Frederick the Great was a very kind of, devout learner, right? He was reading all the time. And so he writes what is called anti-Machiavel. If you remember from our previous lectures, Machiavelli, he ended up writing during the kind of Italian states and Renaissance, he ended up writing this critique and understanding of rulers and all of the dirty politics that goes into it. And so Frederick is writing against Machiavelli's views because Machiavelli was advocating for more democratic principles because he was seeing all of this corruption around him from all of these kind of ingrained institutional rulers. But Frederick the Great is saying, no, I am actually favoring enlightened absolutism. He was reading all of this French literature from Voltaire and other, enlightened minds. And so he eventually just solidified his position and said, I favor an absolute ruler who does take some of the Enlightenment ideals and passes it into reforms as necessary. And so you can probably start to see a pattern here. The Russian monarchs are solidifying their rule with an iron fist and passing some meaningful reforms from the Enlightenment. Frederick the Great is also ruling with an iron fist with the 7 Years' War, doubling the size of the military, but also passing some meaningful legislation and reforms for the people. And so it ends up, being kind of a, I guess, supposed balanced middle ground, right, if you will. Here's a famous painting of Frederick the Great speaking with the local farmers, because he was kind of nicknamed, right, and seen as, perhaps like the great giver, right, the great farmer. And so he definitely was known throughout Prussia as, allowing the people much greater freedoms, right, because he was bestowing this now usable land for them to farm on. And at the same time, he was a heavy patron of the arts. Here he is on the left-hand side at one of the banquets, famously playing, a tune from his flute, because he was well-versed in the musical arts and other, passions. And on the right-hand side, dressed in his military garb, something that Peter III of Russia always tried to emulate, right? Now let's look at the Holy Roman Empire, or perhaps I should say the not-so-holy Roman Empire. So as you can tell, we are slowly moving west. Started in the east with Russia, moved a little bit west towards Prussia with a P. We're in the Holy Roman Empire, which is in the now Germany, kind of northern Italy territory. And then we are going to go all the way west towards France, where we are going to start and end the French Revolution. But the Holy Roman Empire, we got our main cheese here, Joseph II, the Holy Roman Emperor. And so he was also considered an quote-unquote enlightened despot. And, he actually did an enormous amount of change. To his credit, I mean, the guy was so happy to pass any laws or edicts that he could. He issued over 6,000 edicts and passed over 11,000 new laws because he needed to reorganize the entirety of the empire as best as he could. And so, he truly wanted to kind of bring them into a new age. And so we have some, famous laws here. The Patent of Toleration, granting freedom of religion to all of these non-Catholic Christians, Lutherans, Calvinists, Eastern Orthodox, etc. Revolutionary for the time. Remember a few lectures ago, we were, viewing all of these kind of horrific religious wars between these folks. Now, toleration, right? All are welcome. The serfdom patent. He decreed that serfdom would be abolished from the empire and get rid of this master-serf relationship so that people can work independently, pursue their own careers, move between estates, or essentially move between the different class systems of society, right, based on your hard work. Revolutionary at the time. So we have the Russian Empire, right, forcing the people to maintain the brutal system of serfdom, right? And then here in the Holy Roman Empire, they are trying to give as much freedom as possible, right? And so the main point for the Holy Roman Empire under Joseph II was that he was probably one of the most radical, if not the most radical, of the Enlightenment monarchs, because he passed more reforms to better the lives of his people than all of these others. Some of his reforms ultimately ended up failing because of the political backlash from the nobility, right, that he was getting. Because you always have to maintain this kind of balance and status quo, otherwise one side is going to get too disgruntled. But you have to give him credit. He truly wanted to push, right, into the era of progress. And so this entire period of time is going to essentially boil down to the monarchs trying to hold on to their power and all of this new kind of reform age system, right? Trying to balance it out and kind of pull people into that direction. And so we start to see the, various, let's say, caricatures, right, of Joseph II kind of leading the headway for people to get more into farming, right, and kind of lead the way, right, as such. A few more, studly paintings, right, of him, being all royal and glorious. Of course, having, the piece of paper on the right-hand side, thereby showing that he is a man that will, get things done under his legislation and his new reforms. And so my overall thoughts on this entire enlightened despot situation. Although these Enlightenment ideals were spreading very far, thanks to many philosophers such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and others, right? John Locke, Holmes, etc., right? All these philosophers writing for the betterment of society, for folks getting more rights, natural rights, more representation in government, etc., right? All these radical ideals at the time. On the one hand, some of these rulers were implementing meaningful reforms for their people. So if it were not for these Enlightenment thinkers and ideals, they would not have done so. On the other hand, they simultaneously strengthened their own monarchies to create these absolute monarchies and ended up ruling with a strong iron fist and a centralized government. And so in the end, could we truly call all of these individuals enlightened despots? I would say it's a bit in the middle, right? There's some gray area. Yes, because they were passing a lot of meaningful legislation that they probably would not have passed otherwise. But no, because some of the Enlightenment ideals were advocating for more representation in government, to share power or more power with the people. A kind of symbiotic relationship similar to, let's say, a constitutional monarchy. And so they ultimately ended up wanting to grab more power for themselves. So in some aspects, yes. In some aspects, no. Gray area in between. Just like life. It's never just black and white. Part 2. The French Revolution. Vive la France. So let us begin. This is going to be an interesting ride. And it's going to go from the beginning of the French Revolution all the way towards the end. And after this, we're going to, for tomorrow, for the next lecture, we're going to be looking at Napoleon. And then after that, slowly but surely, we are going to start branching off into other kind of lectures and areas of the world. And so as far as Europe goes, the French Revolution is perhaps one of those quintessential famous moments, right, in history. So last time we looked at France, we were looking at the grandfather of King Louis XVI. So if we are looking at King Louis XVI right now, his grandfather was King Louis XIV. Last time we looked at it, I believe in the Nation States lecture. King Louis XIV, or his nickname, the Sun God King, was the epitome of absolute monarchy. The country was rich and wealthy. The armies were powerful. They were fighting and conquering, right, wherever they could. Gold was flowing. All these building projects were created, right? France was sitting at the top of the world. And very shortly, in a couple generations, his grandson ends up, destroying it all. And let's see how this happened. So King Louis XVI ends up being the last king of France, right? Or, France. And so at the age of 15, he married his 14-year-old wife, the Archduchess Maria Antonia, or how she is popularly known as Marie Antoinette. And so they failed to produce children for a few years, probably because they were just too young. Eventually they were kind of parents of 4, but of course, pamphlets and magazines were kind of mocking the king with his perceived infertility, right? Maybe, some things were wrong on his end or whatever. And there were some rumors of perhaps of extramarital affairs. But yeah, when we're looking at a lot of the kind of historical context, Marie Antoinette, when they first met, she did, note that he was a bit kind of nerdy and clunky, and there was that awkward teenage phase. But I doubt there was any extramarital affairs. But after a few years, he ends up ascending the throne at 19 years old. Could you imagine, 19 years old, you are given the responsibility of ruling an entire nation? Definitely a big responsibility to place on someone's shoulders. Now, at this time, the people of France and other areas of Europe as well were getting tired of this entire despotic monarchy system. They were tired of these monarchs having absolute rule over their lives. They were reading all of these Enlightenment ideals that were spread like wildfire throughout cafes, throughout the streets. So they were reading the words and the philosophies, right, of all of these intellectuals and telling themselves, yeah, I want more representation for the people, right? It's not fair that these kings and queens could just decide our fate, right, and what's happening. And so the slow discontent is rising. King Louis XVI, unfortunately, did not have a great temperament to begin with to be the ruler that could, let's say, navigate his way through this crisis, or about to be crisis. He was a very indecisive individual and a bit lazy, and he did not want to essentially be ruler. He just stayed at the palace, partied, had banquets, right? He was not a ruler, right? Like his grandfather. His grandfather was involved in pretty much every facet of the kingship. He always knew what the financial state of France was, where the armies were located, what was going on, always negotiating with other nations, right? He was truly like ingrained in the job of king. And so this, as I say in most of my lectures and classes, this is a double-edged sword. Because rulers, if we are looking at world history and all of these, absolute rulers or monarchs or anything, generally, if we're looking at a monarchy or an empire or some system of government where the head of government sits at the very top under one individual, it is actually a very effective and efficient way of government if you have a very competent person at the top, right? It is extremely efficient. Imagine, if you will, all of the United States problems currently, all of the red tape, the bureaucracy, Congress bickering back and forth, right? Let's say if the nation was on one goal, one mindset, the things we could accomplish. It's one of the advantages that China has over us at the moment, just because their style of government and rule of law under one party, right? They just get it done, right? There's no red tape. But the other edge of the sword is that, for this style of government where power is rested onto one person, if you are incompetent and you don't know what you're doing, it could be an enormous disaster because you're leading the entire nation into financial ruin or losing territory or what have you. So we're going to see how Louis the 16th is going to fare. So from what we read in his memoirs, Louis the 16th did actually have this kind of general notion that he wanted to be liked by the people, right? He wanted to be beloved. He wanted to be a good king. However, he did not understand that to be a good king, you have to put in the work of a good king. And so here on the left, at the ripe age of 20, right, he has his portrait. And over there on the right-hand side, at the age of 27, I believe, just a few short years later, he is kind of seen again. And, he with Marie Antoinette's bust, right, behind him. And so he is trying to, of course, as other kings have done for centuries, have all of these painting and all of this royal, jewelry and clothes to personify his power, right, and his legitimacy. But unfortunately, like I said before, he was a bit too concerned with the glamorous side of ruling and not the nitty-gritty portion of ruling. And here's Marie Antoinette, right? We're going to get into more of her history later, especially towards the march onto Versailles. But Marie Antoinette had an interesting history as well. She was of Austrian birth, an Austrian princess. And of course, just like any other European love story, the marriages are arranged for political reasons. And so she is sent to France in order to marry Louis XVI at the age of 14. Imagine that for yourself for one moment. Now, as soon as King Louis XVI is in a position of power and authority, he must contend with the reality of French politics, which is the three estates, as they are called, or estates of the realm. So essentially, in France's system of governance, there were three sectors, right, where you could find yourself in: the clergy, or the church; the nobility, if you're a noble birth and you have a castle and lands and anything else; and commoners, all the way at the bottom. And so the commoners section ended up comprising 97% of the population. Could you imagine? The clergy and the nobility ended up being only 3% of the population. And I'll just throw this fact in right now, and it's going to come in handy later on. But the clergy and the nobility sections, they were exempt from taxes. Just let that sink in. If you are a commoner living in the 97%, and all of the extremely wealthy individuals up top, are enjoying their castles and their lavish gold and anything else, but they're paying no taxes, that is not a great recipe for success, and it's going to come biting Louis XVI in the butt later. But as Louis XVI early on is going to start finding out that, French kings have to balance power between these various stages, because you have to manage the various sectors of your society. You have the nobles, you have the commoners, you have the powerful church and the cardinals and archbishops, right? You have to play a political game and make sure everyone is happy. And if something falls out of balance, potentially the entire system could come crumbling down, which eventually it did. And so we see troubles on the horizon in the Flower War, where various parts of France ended up going into a food shortage. And so they start to riot. And it was primarily due from mismanagement of resources. And nothing was pretty much being done at the top. You could imagine that if there was even, let's say, a mismanagement of resources, right? And oops, we forgot that X, Y, and Z amounts of food were supposed to go to Paris and all these other people, but we miscalculated. At the very least, a normal competent monarch would very quickly write to various other kingdoms and say, hey, we'll pay good money. Can you please send food right now, right? To do something. But of course, Louis XVI did not. And so we ended up seeing an increased rise of grain prices, bread prices skyrocketing, food was becoming scarce. People were sometimes literally now starving on the streets. And so resentment is growing. Meanwhile, King Louis XVI is not really actively changing this, and he's just enjoying his lavish lifestyle at the palace, not being aware of what is going on. And his wife, Marie Antoinette, her reputation was also suffering because the people, now that they are hungry, right, in the streets, they are not taking kindly to the king or the queen. And so all bets are off on the queen as well. They initially did not like her anyways because she was not of French birth. She was an Austrian, right, by all cases and considerations. And so they end up publishing many rumors that she is a gambler. She is a drunkard. She always just buys luxurious clothing and spends France's money. That's why we're in trouble. That's why we're in a deficit. And that she hosts elegant banquets and that they throw food away, right? All of these kind of scandalous rumors, right, that are going to be proliferating. At the same time, The finances are getting worse and worse. France, during this time, is reeling back because of enormous amounts of debt. And to a certain extent, you cannot blame all of this on King Louis XVI because he was the inheritor of this problem. At the very least, even if he was an incompetent ruler, as we have seen throughout centuries of rule in world history, right? Millennia even. Even if you are an incompetent ruler, let's say if you inherit the throne and everything is fine, no one is pounding at the gates to conquer your lands, money is plentiful, food is plentiful, you can kind of get away with being a quote-unquote okay ruler. This is not one of those times because King Louis XV, his father, ended up presiding over much of the 7 Years' War. And France essentially almost went into a bankrupted state because they were funding all of this war for 7 years. And not just a light skirmish here and there. We're talking about full-scale war with other European nations, which sucked up gold like nobody's business. And so King Louis XVI entered into all of this chaos because France was essentially going bankrupt, right? There was almost no money left. They were borrowing on credit. And so in a last-ditch effort, King Louis, right, he doesn't know what to do. King Louis XVI here, he doesn't know what to do, right? He's not like well-versed in finances. So he hires some ministers to try to reform the finances and try to, at least save, right? Save their hides. And, meanwhile, he understands that people are trying to feed themselves, right? They're trying to make bread and have food. Because bread at that point in time was a very good staple part of anybody's diet because it is cheap to make and it fills your stomach, right? You feel full after eating like a nice chunk of loaf of bread. So we have three different folks that he ends up trying to hire to make reforms. We have Turgot, Necker, and we have Charles. And so the first one, Turgot, advocates for opening up the country to trade. Importantly, taxing the nobility, right, and the religious sector. But of course, the nobility and the clergy ended up hating him and saying, no, we're not going to pay anything, right? We're not going to increase taxes. Not even increase taxes. We're not going to pay taxes at all. And so they turn on the monarchy. And of course, King Louis XVI just says, okay, well, that's not a good idea. Throw Turgot out. Necker, you're up to bat. What can you do? So he appoints Necker, and he starts to create loans to try to fund the French debt and increase interest rates rather than taxes. So essentially tries to grab loans from other countries, right, in order to kind of at least get some finances to pay for something. And instead of increasing taxes on the people immediately, he starts to raise interest rates. So kind of like a slower burn effect. But it did not lead to fast enough results because they needed an influx of cash right now. So he was forced to resign by the king because results were not being made. A couple years later, Charles comes in and increases the public spending to buy the country out of debt. Essentially, let's just spend all we have and try to fix the situation. Let's buy more food. Let's do whatever. And he even said, I want all three of the estates to now pay taxes because, the finances here are not making sense. Most of the money and the wealth is in the top two estates. So, how else do you want me to solve this crisis? And so he was, of course, rejected for his ideals and nothing got done. So as you can start to tell, the top administrations are not doing a great job with the tax systems. If you have some time, with our wonderful resident, historian John Green, we have a wonderful crash course video here. It's like 14, 15 minutes long, made only a few months ago. So great visuals, great kind of cartoon characterization. So if you have some time, you want to kind of encapsulate all of this into like a nice little video, please feel free to watch it. But now the revolution truly begins with the Estates General. So it is called the Estates General because we have those three estates, right? Clergy, nobility, commoners. And the Estates General has been called. Things are getting so bad that the king has called the Estates General, which is a meeting, official meeting of all three estates, the heads of the estates, the heads of the clergy, the heads of the nobility, and the heads of the commoners. And such a meeting had not been convened for 175 years, since 1614. So as you can tell, these were dire times. And so because of all these increased tensions that they had, the people, the commoners, demanded for reforms. Clearly, the things at the moment were not working properly, and they were advocating for change. And so Louis, right, was called by the Estates General, especially by the commoners, to enact some type of meaningful change. He had a chance to save his skin. But a major mistake that he allowed to slip by him, because this was the moment where he could have just turned everything around. So because the people, the commoners, they represented 97% of the population, they essentially said, we want twice the representation in the voting, at the very least. If we are having a 3-tier system, right, it was going by 1 vote each. So typically, whenever the commoners, right, on the lower sector, wanted any type of reforms, the top 2, the clergy and the nobility, would just vote together. So it was a 2v1 vote, and that's it. They got their way. Not too fair. And so they wanted at least twice the representation in the voting. So King Louis and the other states obviously said no to this. They said, no, this is tradition. This is how things have always been. And so obviously the leaders of the commoners, they were riled, right? They were just so scathing angry at the situation that they just left the Estates General meeting. And they ended up creating what was called the National Assembly, the first democratic represented assembly. And so if their mindset was, if the king is not going to hear us out and give us some type of meaningful representation in politics or government or something, because things are not working right now, we're literally starving, then we are going to take matters into our own hands and we will represent ourselves, the people. And so here is a representation of the Estates General meeting. Now, these are famous cartoons, right? Political cartoons. And we have the clergy and the nobility on both sides, the right and the left here, riding the backs of the commoners. And so these were popular political cartoons that were proliferated all throughout France, showing the people that, listen, we are the foundation of France. And these two classes are essentially just, having a wonderful picnic off of the, sweat and work of us, right? This is not fair. So if you were, completely upset and angry at this moment in time, you can clearly see that how these, representations and the imagery here would absolutely get your blood going, right? And boiling. If you have some free time, here's a wonderful kind of little short video of the Estates General and a little bit of a recap of what happened, just to kind of put you into the mood, for like the meeting, right, happening between the three estates. Now that the Estates General ended and the National Assembly was called, right, for them to form their own type of representative government, King Louis XVI does not want that to happen. So he orders whatever meeting hall they were going to be in, he orders it to be closed. So upon arriving there, the National Assembly found the doors locked and closed, but nearby they found a tennis court. So they said, the heck with it, we're just going to go to the tennis court. Who cares where we will deliberate and talk as long as we can actually get our words across. So they ended up meeting at a tennis court, and in what it is known as the famous tennis court oath, they promise and, swear onto an oath, vowing not to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances require until the constitution of the kingdom is established. Or, in more layman's terms, we are not going to give up until we form a constitution for a representative government, right? And so the main point of all of this is that this was truly seen as a revolutionary act. Because if you, from our previous lectures, all of the centuries of rule and monarchies and kingdoms and the church being all powerful and the popes and all of this institutionalized rule, and for centuries people being told, you have to worship me because God gave me authority. You have to worship me because this is the institution. You must worship me because this is tradition. And now all of that is being put on top of its head. And now democratic processes are coming into the light, and people are starting to tell themselves that we want to now represent ourselves, right? We do not need or want for you to tell us what to do anymore. And so some beautiful imagery here of what the tennis court oath most likely looked like. Oh, for any of you wondering why this is in a building, they had indoor tennis courts as well. And so once the National Assembly was called, they started to pass some democratic laws, such as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, where these were very revolutionary ideals, where they started to talk about the doctrine of natural rights. You are born with certain natural rights that should not and cannot be taken away from you. Something that is completely against the grain of absolute monarchy, where the monarch could just say, I will imprison you and your entire family just because I feel like it. And here we're having these natural rights saying, no, you deserve fair trial, you deserve X, Y, and Z. Stating that the rights of men are held to be universal and that individuals should be protected by the law. There was heavy inspiration here from the American Revolution and the Founding Fathers, because General Lafayette was working closely during the American Revolution with Thomas Jefferson. And so a lot of the early Declaration of Independence writing and the Virginia State Constitution and others, Thomas Jefferson was working with the French, and so a lot of that language kind of proliferated itself back into the French Revolution. And so they started to write in to all of these declarations various tenets from the Enlightenment, from individualistic and humanities style philosophies, from the philosophers that we were thinking about, John Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu, all of these different writers, all of these social contracts, right? Everything being poured into these declarations. So truly, the Enlightenment, manifested itself here. And the new body, the National Assembly, now went to the church, right? The clergy that failed to say we are going to pay taxes and help you out during this time of need. They now went to the church and said, we are taking over the church, and you and all of the church property is now at the disposal of the nation, which is an enormous sum of money, right? If you've ever been into some of the churches or have seen the paintings of churches during this time, they're just filled with gold and, beautiful artwork everywhere and golden crosses and jewels, right? They had wealth. And so if the state starts to take command of the church and all of its holdings, that's an enormous sum of money too. But that also means that the state, the government now, has to take on the role of the church with feeding the sick and helping the poor and helping orphans as well. So that was some of the role of what the church was doing for all these years as well. But the main kind of inspirational point here is that the people are rising up. The people are creating this representative democratic government for themselves. And so as we are going into further into this timeline, eventually, of course, violence is going to erupt. And the main kind of battle cry of violence ends up being the storming of the Bastille, or the famous French prison in Paris. I was fortunate enough last year to visit Paris. I saw the remnants of the Bastille, which modernly there's nothing left. Is just a street intersection, but there's a huge kind of basilisk monument there. Kind of like a remnant. But even today in France, Bastille Day is still seen as pretty much kind of like the 4th of July, right? It's huge over there. But the Bastille at this point in time was such a long-held famous prison. It was like a fortress, right? A miniature castle. And it was the symbol of the monarchy's power and authority over the people, right? It was famous. And so the fact that the Bastille was now being stormed by the people of Paris and taken over, it was seen as a symbolic hit to the monarchy, right? And so by taking this famous prison away from the king, they are showing all of France that we are not afraid of the monarchy anymore. We have just stormed and destroyed the famous Bastille. And there have been many various paintings kind of depicting this, famous event here. But as we're going through some of these paintings, right, the story behind it is, as the folks were moving closer and closer to the Bastille and the crowd was gathering, there were various representatives at the head of the crowd. Now, the Bastille themselves, they were shortly manned. They did not have their full garrison with them. And on top of that, for safety reasons, the military had sent plenty of ammunition and gunpowder to the Bastille for safekeeping, because they never thought it was going to get stormed. And so the crowd ends up entering. They ended up meeting at the gates of the Bastille, talking with the guards here and there. Things do not go well, and so the outer perimeter of the Bastille ends up being broken into. And then they start having negotiations so that they can get into the interior of the Bastille. And they have back and forth negotiations, and the representatives of the mob end up, yelling something to the crowds, something to the effect of, like, don't go in, right? Or like, the job is done here, whatever. But the crowd misinterprets and thinks that it's a rallying cry. And so the fervor increases and they storm the Bastille by force. And they start to fire cannons at the Bastille. And pistols and rifles are crackling, and swords and shovels and any object to stab somebody with, right, are being used. And so the guards are being torn apart, and the Bastille is being dismembered brick by brick. And so truly they have kind of taken down, right, this huge symbol of the monarchy. And here is from an old movie, kind of depicting some, like probably what the storming of the Bastille would have looked like. And so from this wonderful movie, it's only, I think, like a 2-minute clip, kind of shows, the mob kind of running in, right, and kind of hacking and slashing their way through, and the guards trying to, desperately defend, but you can only do so much on, against like crazy odds against yourself. Fast forward a little bit after the famous Bastille, and the women of Paris start to rally together in rallying cries, because if there is a food shortage, and of course people are starving and not having enough food and dying, the mothers of France, the mothers of Paris are going to, obviously be disgruntled the most, because they cannot feed their families or take care of their children. And so on October 5th in 1789, we have large demonstrations in Paris, and thousands and thousands of people, right? Especially the women of Paris, the mothers, the wives, are joining in massive riots at the marketplaces because there is a shortage on food. And the final quote-unquote trigger was a rumor, or a report, that probably did not happen. And probably Marie Antoinette did not say this, but the report was there nonetheless because of scandalous newspaper or, pamphlet reports. And so the rumor was that Marie Antoinette was currently holding a lavish banquet at the Palace of Versailles. And that reportedly, the rumor was, when people were telling her that, oh, the people are starving on the streets, they want bread. And then she famously reportedly said, let them eat cake, right? And so that was just seen as a disgusting form of rule, right? The fact that you do not appreciate or respect the people of France to the point where you just jokingly, mockingly say, let them eat cake, that was the last straw. Once again, reportedly, most likely that didn't happen, but the tabloids, the tabloids. And so from Paris, we have around 10,000 women and others in the crowd rallying together, and they march towards the palace with pitchforks and torches and anything else they have. And so around 6 a.m., the protesters make their way to the Palace of Versailles. They break down the gates. They kill a number of the royal guard. They rip their heads off and they chop their heads off with the butcher knives that they have, and whatever pikes and weaponry that they steal from them. They put their heads onto the pikes and start to ram the doors of the palace. They end up getting into the palace and start to search for Marie Antoinette, right? They start to search for the lady who supposedly said, let them eat cake. And so they were scrambling to get to her door, to get to her bedroom. Once they finally got to her bedroom, they started to take their knives out and stab the bed wildly in order to kill her and see her blood flow through the sheets. But unfortunately for them, Marie Antoinette was not there, because she had one of those really cool secret doorways hidden. And so as soon as she heard the chaos, she took her children and snuck through the secret doorway. And the protesters ended up finding the king. King Louis XVI, just lounging about as he does. And so the crowd speaks to him and has a pleasant conversation with him. But at the end of the conversation, they essentially say, you are coming back to Paris with us. Because even though they were having a nice conversation with him, and he ended up acquiescing and saying, oh, well, there's a food shortage? Please, the palace will provide some food, right? Temporarily, like whatever I can do. The fact that he was just so inept and did not really fully grasp and understand what was going on, they said, no, you are going to come back to Paris with us and live there so you can see what's going on. You can be in the middle of it all. And so he and Marie Antoinette are escorted by the remainder of the palace guards and the entire mob back to Paris. And so the Women's March onto the Palace of Versailles is seen as both a testament to the people of France taking hold their pride as French citizens, right, as human beings, and trying to reestablish order between the people and the monarchy itself, and of course a huge kind of victory for female agency at the time. Here is a picture inside of the Palace of Versailles. I was actually in this room a year ago. And there is her bed, Marie Antoinette's bed, and on the left side, it is the famous secret door. So when you close the door, it almost is indistinguishable from the rest of the wallpaper, right? It perfectly just blends in. And so the fact that she just snuck through, that is what ended up saving her life. And so here's a little bit of a recap on the March of Versailles if you have a couple of minutes of time. Not too long, but still a good video to kind of give you like the sense of what has been occurring. And so here we have fear leads to execution. So now that King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and the children have been brought to Paris, eventually, King Louis XVI is getting gravely concerned. This is not merely a rebellion, Because the word rebellion means that there is a possibility for the monarchy or for the troops to put down the rebellion, like Catherine the Great did with the Pugachev rebellion, right? Brutally repressing it and killing thousands. But when Louis XVI heard about the storming of the Bastille in the morning after it was stormed and taken over, he famously asked his advisor, "Oh, is this a rebellion?" And then his advisor famously said back, "No, sire, this is a revolution." And so he was getting enormously worried and started to write to Austria, right? The monarchy of Austria, because that is where Marie Antoinette's family is, right? She is Austrian, and that's, very close to the border with them. And so he was in secret communication, and the Austrian monarchy ends up telling them, "Get yourself into Austrian territory. We will protect you. At the very least, we will protect you. And if anything, we will then send troops to help reestablish the monarchy." Because a lot of these monarchs throughout Europe needed to look after each other. Because imagine if you're sitting at the head of a monarchy and then the French Revolution spirals out of control and kills the king. What's to say that that is not going to happen in your neck of the woods either? So all of the monarchs in Europe were carefully looking at the situation and also gravely worried, because that could possibly mean it would be a chain reaction all throughout their kingdoms as well. And so King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette ended up fleeing in the middle of the night. But unfortunately for them, King Louis XVI did not really think too well about this escape strategy, because you might imagine in the middle of the night when all of France is looking for you, you would perhaps maybe put on some raggedy clothes, get on horseback, and just ride for your life. But no, he ends up riding in his carriage that is adorned with gold and very ceremonial, so sticks out like a sore thumb. And so they are going through one of the cities, one of the small towns, and for whatever reason, it is unsure in the historical record what the reason was. Some historians debate he got hungry, he wanted to stop by and eat something, or he had an interaction with one of the locals. But for whatever reason, historians can agree that for some reason he was noticed that, oh, the king is here. And they end up bringing him and his family back to Paris forcefully. And at this point in time, at least the people in Paris and the National Assembly was still entertaining the idea of establishing a constitutional monarchy. They were entertaining the idea of course, having all of this various new legislation and reforms and more representation in government for the people. But perhaps, maybe like Britain, we will be a constitutional monarchy. But the fact that the monarch fled in the middle of the night broke any remaining trust that they had. And that essentially sealed his fate. And so here is a painting representation of King Louis, Marie, and their children, right, being found out and, forcibly kind of, being taken back to Paris. And of course, famously, King Louis XVI is now up for the chopping block to be escorted to the guillotine for a beheading. For those of you who are not sure of what a guillotine is, it is an ingenious contraption for death. So essentially, you get on your knees, you kneel down, and your head bows forward. Your head is placed through a circular opening, and it is closed on top so your neck cannot escape, right? Your neck is fixed in place. Above you, around 20 feet higher or so, there is this large metal sheet, which is razor sharp on the edge. And at a moment's notice, they press a lever, and the sheet falls down with gravity and then slices itself. And then slices itself across your neck, thereby decapitating you. Now, it is said that as soon as a head is severed from the body, so quickly and vigorously, it is said that the blood flow in your brain is still moving forward and the synapses are still firing. So you still are conscious and you are seeing and recording everything in your mind for another, 10, 20 or so seconds. So imagine you laying there and the guillotine chops your head off, and then you kind of see your head kind of rolling into the basket, and then you see yourself in the basket. A very weird experience, probably. Here are a couple of wonderful videos. The one on the right-hand side is a little like snippet, a biographical view of Marie Antoinette. And the one on the left-hand side is an interesting, it's like only 3 minutes long, but it is from, it is a wonderful story of a professor kind of giving their knowledge on when King Louis XVI was found out in one of those villages, right, and brought back to Paris when someone finally said, aha, it is the king, right, and they recognize him. So a pretty interesting couple minutes of your time here if you want to give it a try. And here it is from a movie that is pretty well done, a little old, but still gets the point across and shows King Louis XVI, ceremoniously brought in by carriage, and him going up towards the guillotine and kind of showing you what the process is like. Of course, they're not showing the bloodshed everywhere, but it's still kind of a good scene. Also, just a couple minutes long, not too much of your time on this one, but it kind of wraps it all in. And so my final thoughts on the absolute monarchy seeing its decline. Although we were seeing many monarchs that were solidifying their absolute rule throughout Europe, the fall of this long-lasting French monarchy, this absolute monarchy, it shook Europe to its core, and it shook the other European monarchs to its core. Even as far as the Ottoman Empire, it shook them a little bit to their core, because these Enlightenment ideals were spreading quickly and people were reading them. And so a very well-established monarchy such as France, the fact that their king was just decapitated and the revolution was successful, any monarch, whether it was England, Spain, Russia, whatever, they were now looking at their own people very carefully. And any sign of dissent was met with strict and harsh retaliation. And so, once again, these enlightened monarchs were now kind of pedaling backwards and consolidating even more power for fear of losing that power. And so all in all, the French Revolution was truly a monumental moment in world history. It got inspiration from the American Revolution, from the Americas, from Enlightenment ideals, which received its foundations from the Renaissance, which received its foundations from Greco-Roman culture and heritage and writings, which in turn received much of its heritage from the Middle East, from ancient Egypt, from the Silk Road, from China, and from India as well, right? All of this wealth of knowledge culminating itself into the Enlightenment, into these ideals, and finally culminating into the French Revolution itself. And so the French Revolution is merely not a moment for France or Europe, but the world, as the ideals of liberté, égalité, and fraternité were reverberated throughout the intellectual halls of Europe and abroad. And so if you have some quick time, we also have a Enlightened Monarchs kind of recap here as well, because our next sections are going to deal with the very fearful repercussions of the French Revolution and with Robespierre. And then shortly after, we are going to get into Napoleon and those sections. But with that, we are at the end of the Absolute Despots and French Revolution section. And remember to keep up with your readings. Remember to maintain the deadline for the discussion questions due on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. I hope you have a wonderful week. Hope you have a great weekend whenever you are watching this. And thank you as always for being here, for listening. I hope I was able to consolidate some of this information for you. And please email me if there are any questions about any of this. I'll be more than happy to elaborate or explain. Have a wonderful day, evening, whatever time it is for you, and I'll see you next time.